Okay, so this is lesson 2 of part C. And remember, part C, our objective dealt with given the graph of a function, find the domain and range. And so make sure before you look at lesson 2 that you looked at lesson 1 because this is a continuation of that lesson. So remember in lesson 1 there were arrows on both sides. On the right side you had an arrow, the left side you had an arrow. This is different. Notice on the in behavior, the right side here has an arrow, the left side has a closed circle. I'm using the word closed circle. So some of these problems we're going to look at closed circles and we're going to look at open circles. Okay? And what does that mean? Closed circles and open circles, what did that mean in relation to domain and range? How does it affect the domain and range? Okay? All right, so for example, in one of the problems we're gonna look at, you're gonna see something like this, where the end behavior on the right has an arrow, the left side is a open circle. So that's what an open circle looks like. This is what a closed circle looks like. Okay? All right, so that's gonna be important. All right, so just like we did in lesson 1, you remember the domain? The domain is the set of x coordinates. And just like I mentioned, it's a good idea. It's a good idea to use a ruler to help you with this. So the domain, you're going to go along the x-axis and you look at what happens to the graph when you cross over the ruler. So notice that this closed circle, so there's no arrow here, right? So this is where you're going to start. So this is where my ruler is going to start touching the graph right here. So I'm going to ask you, what is that x coordinate? Because we are talking about domain. We are talking about domain. So the domain is a set of x coordinates. So this x coordinate right here, if you think of the point, that's -8, -4. So my x coordinate is -8, right? So you're going to say bracket -8 all the way, and notice this arrow keeps going. All right, so think about that arrow keeps going all the way to positive infinity. And remember, with infinity, you always use parentheses. So -8 has a bracket. -8 has a bracket because this is a closed circle. So I'm going to write this right here. Closed circle, closed circle. You're going to use bracket. Okay, so make sure you remember that. Closed circle, bracket. So now let's talk about the range. The range is a set of y coordinates, and you go from bottom on the y-axis. You go from bottom up. So notice the arrows on this side. This is a closed circle, so this is where I start touching the graph, right here. That's where I start touching the graph. And so the question is, what's that y value? Well, that y value is -4. So now I'm going from bracket -4 all the way to, it keeps on going, because remember the arrow keeps on going, all the way to positive infinity. All right, so notice the parentheses on positive infinity, and notice that on the -8 and -4, those are brackets because this is a closed circle. Okay, so that is a point on the graph. So a closed circle means this point is on the graph, just like all these other points. All these other points on the graph. All these other points on the graph. So this is also a point on the graph because it's closed. All these are closed as well. These are all closed circles if you want to think about it. All right, so that's that one. Let's look at the next one. The next one, we have this. All right, we have this. So again, you have a closed circle on the left. You have an open. You have a arrow on the right. So in terms of domain, you go from left to right. So notice that I start touching a graph at this closed circle, right? And the question is, what is that x value? Well, that is -6. So if you think about it, that point is -6, 5. This point right here, -6, 5. So my smallest x value is -6. Since that's a closed circle, I use a bracket. Bracket -6, comma, all the way. Now you got to visualize this keep going down like this. All right, so it's very it's very steep right here going down, but it actually, you got to visualize that it's actually going to negative infinity. So at some point, if this was -100,000, this ruler would touch the graph. All right, so negative infinity, I'm sorry, -6 bracket all the way to infinity. with parentheses. The range, okay, so notice the arrow's pointing down, right? So think of this arrow as pushing this thing down. So you're going from negative infinity all the way, and notice that this is not an arrow, so this is where you stop, but it is a closed circle, right? So, and we are talking about the range, we are talking about the y value. So you gotta look at this y value. That y value is 5. So you go from negative infinity all the way to 5 with a bracket, 5 with a bracket, because that's a closed circle. That's a point on the graph. All right, let's do the next one. So the next one, let's continue thinking about this. All right, so domain and range. So domain, you go along the x-axis. The range, you go along the y-axis like this. Notice though, this time this is an open circle, so that point is not part of the graph. That point's not part of the graph. All right, so you still have an infinite number of points here, except this is not part of the graph. But we still need to talk about it because that's important in our answer. All right, so domain. Let's talk about domain. So notice that the right side has an arrow going down, keeps on going. The left side is just an open circle. That's where it starts or stops, depending on whether you're going x-axis or y-axis. So notice that I start, when I go along the x-axis, this is where I start touching the graph. Okay. So if I keep going any point, I want you to notice this. Look where my pencil point is right here. Any real number greater than -6 is going to have a point on that graph. So listen, I'm sorry, I didn't mean -6, -4, -4. So -3.9999 is on the graph, right, for x. Any point greater than -4, 3.9876, 3.999842, and so on. So that means that for my domain, even though this is an open circle, which means it's not part of the graph, I still must use 6 right here. But I need to put that in parentheses. So my domain is see this point right here, even though it's not part of the graph, it's an open circle. That open circle represents the point -4, -4, 6. So since it's open though, you're going to say parentheses. So you're going to say parentheses all the way to infinity. And then always parentheses with infinity. So that's the difference. So closed circle, you use brackets. Open circle, you use parentheses. So let's go back over here and write that. So with open circle, you're going to use parentheses because that's not a point on the graph. Okay? This, use brackets here because that's a point on the graph. All right. Let's talk about the range for this one. The range. So notice the right side going down. So you're going from -infinity all the way, and then the highest y value. Now be careful. This is where the graph's going to stop. So it's going to stop at this open circle. What's that y value? Well, that y value is 6. Oh, I'm sorry. The domain, let me fix this. The domain is not from 6 to infinity. The domain is from where? -4. That's your x value. -4, excuse me. So -4 to infinity. So from -4 all the way to infinity. Your range is from -infinity all the way to this y value, which is 6, with parentheses. So -infinity, 6 parentheses. Okay. So remember, open circle is parentheses. All right. Next one. Let's look at this one. Notice this time that you don't see any arrows. You see an open circle, closed circle. On the right side, you have a closed circle. On the left side, you have an open circle. All right, no big deal. We can handle that now. You have enough information, enough knowledge to be able to determine the domain and range. Let's talk about the domain. When I go from left to right, this is where I start, right? So think about what that x value is. So this point right here, even though it's an open circle, that open circle represents the point -5, 3. This closed circle right here represents the point 3, 7. So I'm going from, in terms of the domain, your x value, I'm going from -5 all the way to, and this is where you stop. And so tell me what that x value is. That x value is 3. X value is 3. But be careful. One's open, one's closed. So since this is open, you're going to say parentheses, -5, all the way to 3 bracket. That's how it looks. So this -5 represents that it was an open circle, and this point was not on the graph. This 3 bracket represents that this point was a closed circle, which is a point on the graph. All right, let's go about the range. The range, you go from bottom up. So this is where I start touching the graph right here, the open circle. What's that y value? Well, that y value is 3. So parentheses 3, all the way to this y value, which is 7, but it's a closed circle, so I got to say 7 with a bracket. All right, so that was that one. The next one. This time you have open circles on both sides. All right, so let's talk about domain and range. Domain, range. So domain, you go along the x-axis just like this. So when I go along the x-axis, this is where I start touching the graph, right here. And so let's think about what that point represents. That point, the coordinates are -4, 5. Here, that point right here is 5, -2. So labeling it may help you. It may not, but it may. So with domain, you got to think about your x coordinates. So all of these x values right here, all these x values are going to have a point on the graph, and so there's an infinite number of those. So that's why we use interval notation. Now these are both open, so I'm going from -4 when x is -4 all the way to when x is 5. But parentheses, so -4, 5, parentheses. So any real number between -4 and 5, any real number between -4 and 5 will have a point on the graph. The range, you go from bottom up. So your range, you're interested in what are the y values. What are the y values on this graph, for these points? What are the y values? So this is where you start. So your y value here is -2. It's an open circle. So you go in parentheses -2, comma, all the way to, and this is where you stop, at 5. That's your highest y value. Well, up to 5, but not including 5. So like 4.99999 is actually in the range, but 5 is not. So you got to put a parentheses. All right? Okay. Let's look at another one. Notice the right side has an arrow, the left side has parentheses. So we kind of talked about that earlier in another problem. It's okay. Let's do it again. So I'm domain, going from left to right. Domain. So I'm going, this is where I start. This point, remember, it's an open circle. So this point is -5, -2. And this is an arrow, so it just keeps on going. So I'm not going to put a point because it's an arrow. So I'm going from left to right. I started here. So the x value is -5, but it's a parentheses. It's open circle. So I have to say parentheses -5 all the way to infinity. So I want you to notice this. Whenever there's an arrow, whenever you see an arrow, you see that that infinity, right? If it went down, there's an arrow, you'd see a negative infinity. All right, so that infinity implies that there was an arrow involved in one end. So there's an arrow here, you see the idea of infinity. Okay, so let's talk about the range. The range, I go along the y-axis from bottom up, and notice this is where I start touching the graph of this open circle. So that y value is -2. So I'm going parentheses -2 all the way to, it never stops, infinity. Okay? Next one. Now look at what this looks like. So it looks like an absolute value equation, although there are no arrows. So you have an open circle, closed circle. All right, so let's talk about the domain and range. Now be careful with this one. Think before you write anything down. Use your rule if you have to. Sometimes a colored ruler will help you. So as I go from left to right, now notice there are no arrows, right? Okay, no arrows. So you're not going to see infinity, negative infinity at all. Since there are no arrows, you will not see infinity, negative infinity at all. So I start here at an open circle, and that's the point -5, 3. And so my domain, I'm going to start at -5, parentheses, since that's an open circle, comma, all the way, and this is where it stops right here, and that's the 0.54. And so I'm going from -5. So every real number in the interval -5 to 5, x equal 5, will have a point on the graph. Every point on the graph will have an x coordinate that's between -5 and 5. Now I'm going to use bracket with the 5 because that's a closed circle. That's important to remember. So always think, do I need bracket or do I need parentheses? Open circle, you use parentheses. Closed circle, use bracket. Let's talk about the range. The range, you go from bottom up. Notice there are no arrows, so you're not going to be using infinity to negative infinity here. But as I go from bottom up, this is where I start touching the graph, right here. That's the point, -2, -4. But remember, the range is set of y coordinates. So the question you need to ask yourself is, what is this y coordinate right here? Well, that y coordinate is -4. But this is closed. It's not open, so you got to say bracket. So bracket -4 all the way to, now be careful, don't stop here because you still have part of the graph here. This is where it stops, right here. So, and it's closed, and what's that y value? Well, that y value is 4 with a bracket. Okay? All right. So notice the domain. You started this open circle, so that's why you see parentheses, and you ended at this closed circle, that's why you see bracket. The range, you started down here, which is closed, and you ended up here, which is closed. That's why you see brackets. All right. Let's look at this one. So in this one, you do have an arrow, so you are going to see infinity. And let's be a little bit careful with this as we go through this. Let's do domain first. All right, domain. So remember, you go from left to right. So as I go from left to right, this is where I touch the graph, right here. All right, and that's the point -5, -6. So I'm going from, and remember it's closed, so I'm going from bracket -5, comma. Now be careful, see this is an arrow, so it keeps on going, right? Keeps on going. Think about that. Keeps on going all the way to infinity with parentheses. All right, now be careful with the range. The range. Some students mess up with this one. I'll put the range right here. With the range. Some students mess up. Okay, so with the range, some students think that this is where it starts. This is where it starts. Look at your graph. Is it really where it starts? See, you got to be careful. I put the arrow here, but doesn't that mean that this part of the graph keeps going down like this, right? So is this your starting point? Is this where the graph starts? No, because I'm going to ask you, this right here, this y value, is there going to be a point in the graph? Yes, there will. If you extend this, you get this point right here. So you got to visually think that this arrow, this part of the graph keeps going down. So now I'm going from negative infinity, right? Negative infinity all the way to this, and then I stop there, all the way to this point, which has y value, let's see, that's 2, 3. So the y value is 3. And notice there's not an open circle, it's closed. So you're going to say negative infinity all the way to 3 with a bracket. All right, so be careful. Some students, they don't think about what's happening here. Remember, this keeps on going. Keeps on going. So this is not the lowest point. You're actually going from negative infinity. Okay? So you have to be careful. The same idea with this one, isn't it? See, you're not going to make that mistake now, are you? Because this arrow, see, keeps doing this. Okay? So let's talk about the domain. So domain, you go from left to right. So this is where you start, right here. So that's the x coordinate -7. So since it's open circle, you're going to say parentheses -7, comma, all the way, never stops, keeps on going, all the way to infinity. The range, so remember when you have arrows, you're going to have infinity involved. The range, you got to be careful. When you go from bottom up, this is not where it starts because this keeps going down like this. All right, so this arrow's pushing this ruler down. So you got to, since it's pushing this ruler down, you got to think negative infinity. So if this is -100, let's say, I get a point on the graph. There's a y value on that graph there's a point in the graph that has y value negative 100, negative 1000, and so on. So I'm going from negative infinity all the way to this highest y value right here, which is 8. So I'm going from negative infinity all the way to 8 with a bracket. Okay? All right, so remember, always think like that. All right, let's look at this one. So in this one, again, you don't have arrows, so you're not going to be using infinity at all. You have a bracket on the left, open circle on the right. So let's talk about the domain. The domain, this is where you start. You got to think about the x value. So the x is negative 8. It's closed, so you're going to say bracket negative 8, comma, all the way to, and this is where it stops. There are no arrows, so this is where it stops. It's open, but that x value is 6, so you're going to say 6 parentheses. So any real number between negative 8 and 6, you're going to have a point on the graph. A point on the graph is going to have that x coordinate. So any real number, negative 8 is part of the graph, 6 is not. So that's why you see bracket parentheses. The range, you go from bottom up. So notice there are no arrows, so you don't have anything to worry about. This is actually the lowest point right here. So that lowest point has y value negative 2. So remember, the range is a set of y coordinates. That's not an open circle, that's closed. So you're going to say bracket negative 2, comma, all the way. Keep on going. This is where you stop. That's the highest point, but it's open, and so that y value is 7 with parentheses. Okay? All right. And then the last one. Now this is, again, the one that gets students. Notice it's a horizontal ray. The domain, let's talk about the domain. Domain is a set of x coordinates, right? So if I remember this, there's an arrow on the left side, so it keeps on going. So I'm going from negative infinity all the way, and then it stops here. There's an open circle. So that x coordinate is going to be 6 with parentheses. All right, so the domain was not an issue. It's the range, just like in lesson 1 where we looked at that line. Let's talk about the range. So when I go from bottom up, this is the only place where I touch the graph. And remember, we're talking about range, right? So what are those y values? All those y values right here is 5. That y value 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 is 5, and so on. So my range only consists of one number, one element, and that's 5. Even though this is open or closed, it does not matter. It does not matter. There are points on the graph, and the y values are what? 5. All these points, the y values are 5. So my range is just going to be the brace, 5, and close the brace. That's what it looks like. That's the one that gets students right here. It's when it's horizontal. Okay? All right, so that is lesson 2. And that's all I wanted you to think about in terms of finding the domain and range from the graph. All right, so that's going to be the end of this lesson.